Hi, my name is Shelley Wright. We're going to be looking at how educational theory actually plays out in a classroom environment. So the body of thinking that has been the most influential in my classroom is constructivism, which believes that learning is actively constructed and usually it occurs socially. It's based on the work of educational theorists and researchers such as Dewey, Bruner, Kelly, Vygotsky, and Piaget. There are really two general approaches to learning. There's the transmission approach that believes learning is something that is done to the student by an outside source, such as a teacher or a textbook, and a constructivist approach in which the student is rigorously involved with the active process of learning to create deep understanding. And the second approach is the approach I take in my classroom. So the first theorist that's been really influential in my classroom is actually Dewey. And he wrote well over a century ago, and Dewey believed that education is not an affair of telling and being told, but an active and constructive process. So both inquiry learning and my classroom are built on this belief. In the early 20th century, Dewey also forwarded the notion that knowledge is constructed in community. As early as 1899, Dewey advocated that the current system of education, with desks organized in straight rows, bolted to the floor, a uniform curriculum, and the mechanical massing of children, which we call grades, was not conducive to learning in a social setting. And yet, this is what we largely see in our classrooms today. So the first influence is in regards to my classroom structure. The physical space in my classroom is structured to facilitate student conversation. So originally, for the first few years of my teaching, I had my classroom situated in rows like many teachers. This year, with the huge shift that's occurred in my classroom, I didn't find that worked anymore. Students couldn't talk to each other. There wasn't room for us to be doing our projects. We always had to be pushing tables out of the way, and it didn't work well for us. So in response to this, I decided to reconfigure my classroom. The way my classroom is configured now, I actually took out some of the tables so that it opened up this large space in the middle where we can work on projects, where we have space. We actually have something called circle time that my grade 10s invented, and they love it. And the reason they asked for that is because one of my students said, we want to be able, can we sit in a circle? We want to be able to sit down, and we want to be able to see each other and talk to one another. And so in response to that statement, we created this area so that we can do that. And it made my students feel heard. It made them feel like what they needed for learning was important, and it is. The tables that were left were pushed together so that they can now sit around them and look at one another and talk to one another and collaborate. And they have the room with, the space that they have to be able to do that. And so for inquiry to occur, the classroom environment needs to be conducive to it. I think that's one of the most important things. A classroom configured so that students sit in rows facing forward is not an environment that fosters inquiry. Instead, students need to be able to converse with one another and hear and build upon each other's ideas. Furthermore, sitting in rows facing the front of the classroom confirms for many students that they are there to talk to the teacher instead of one another. And likely, the older your students are, the harder you will have to work for your students to unlearn this habit. And because I teach grades 10 to 12, that's really what I spend a lot of time doing at the beginning. I spend time, basically with them unlearning what they've learned in the 10 years that they've been in school before I've had them. So another researcher that's been really significant to my teaching practice is Carol Collier-Coulthau. And she's a researcher who has spent 25 years learning about the inquiry process. And she has created a significant theory around the stages of inquiry learning. So she says that guided inquiry is preparation for lifelong learning, not just preparation for a test. And that was something that really resonated with me. I didn't want to be teaching my students to, memorize facts for an exam, which happens a lot in biology and chemistry, which I teach, and then they'd write the exam and forget it all. And to me, that wasn't learning. And so the inquiry method is something I use because it's this preparation for how to learn for their entire lives. So the term guided inquiry does not necessarily indicate a research path that is scripted or outlined for the student. Instead, most often guided inquiry is something that's facilitated by a teacher. It intervenes at critical stages to help students gain the ability to use tools and resources for learning in and beyond the information age. and while they are learning the content of the curriculum and meeting the subject curriculum standards. So this type of inquiry is most often affirmed by research literature as effective for preparing students to think deeply about a subject and make connections to previous knowledge. So Kuhlthau's research has been incredibly important to my classroom because she has outlined not only that there are distinct stages, but there are specific emotions that are attached to each stage. And for me, that was really the aha moment. That was really one of the most significant finds that I actually found in all of the research that I've done on inquiry learning. And so she's outlined these 7 stages. There's initiation, selection, exploration, formulation, collection, presentation, and assessment. And so this is a whole continuum of the process that happens. And it's not a linear process. Students have to go back to stages, and it's sort of, circular in some places, but eventually students will go through all 7 stages. The significant thing was the emotions. And why this was significant, because during inquiry learning, I could see that my students were struggling with things, but I didn't know what, and I didn't know how to help them. And I didn't understand that there were emotions attached to this, and this is one of the reasons why the theoretical aspect of inquiry is important. I think you can wing it and get decent results, and I mean, certainly when we were doing inquiry learning, we had spectacular results. But knowing now that there are these emotions that are attached allows me to help my students learn better and learn deeper than they did before. So, some of the things they struggled with were how to pull things together, how to create a project with their learning. And sometimes it was just the sheer amount of information that was a stumbling block. And I didn't understand that, during the exploration and formulation stages, students often feel a great deal of confusion and frustration and doubt. They're not sure which pieces are going to fit, and at times it feels like there's so much stuff that they're going to actually go under. And so as a teacher, now that I'm aware of these stages, I can actually intentionally teach them how to, navigate each stage, to use certain techniques and to reflect, to be able to think about their thinking and work their way through. And the emotions, especially, to teach them that, learning is an emotional process. And as teachers, that's something that makes sense to me, because as a learner myself, there are emotions attached to learning. There are those aha moments. There are those frustrating moments when you're sifting through content and you can't find quite the right source. And so for me, it allowed me to intervene at strategic places. And that's the significant thing. So how this connects with the theory is that, constructivist thinking believes that children develop higher order thinking through guidance at critical points in the learning process. And so guided inquiry requires this teacher facilitation for this specific reason, to intervene at these points to facilitate the process, rather than, directly teaching them. Now we teach them how to learn. So this whole idea is based on Vygotsky's concept of a zone of proximal development. And teachers can develop a scaffold of questions to help students develop higher order thinking, such as analysis and synthesis, right? Those higher order skills that we're going for. Much of what is currently taught in education is often limited to shallow processing skills. But we know that scaffolding allows students to do with advice and assistance what he or she cannot do alone, or can only do with great difficulty. And so guided inquiry offers guidance throughout the process. And because I now know that there are these stages and there are these emotions, I'm able to help my students deal with that. So one of the important things with inquiry learning and project-based learning is the idea of essential questions. And inquiry learning is often guided by these. In my classroom, usually my students choose the questions they wish to research. While I choose the theme based on curriculum requirements, I personally don't believe this inhibits the authenticity of the inquiry process. Some purists may argue with that, but I find that students are often interested in things they may not have encountered before. I find that in chemistry. We find that in biology. Students are fascinated with the brain, and yet it hasn't really occurred to them that, hey, I'd like to research this. And so often there are ideas that they may not think to pursue. And so one of the cases where I found this is with the Holocaust. I've never had a student who wasn't interested in the Holocaust, and yet none of my students really know much about the Holocaust. Every year I found that, and I've taught it for 6 or 7 years by now. And they have a very minimal information on what actually occurred in the Holocaust. And so within that larger thematic idea of the Holocaust, they're free to pursue whatever questions they want. And so the way ours worked was they ended up dividing in 3 groups, and the question we ended up framing was basically, what was the impact of the Holocaust on the Jewish community, the German people, and the surrounding world? And that wasn't something that we came up with immediately. The thing that I found with inquiry learning is that up front there needs to be a great deal of communication. And actually the more work that's done in the first stage or two, the more successful your inquiry is likely to be, if you can really pin down that question. And so then we divided up into groups where we had one group who researched the Jewish community and another who researched the German people, and then the surrounding world, the outside world. So, we looked at basically the Allies and how that impacted. And even as we were researching, the questions changed and narrowed, which you'll find in the inquiry process. The Jewish community, that's a really large question, right? That's a really large area. And so as we researched, it became narrower and narrower and narrower until we narrowed it down to a select, topic area where we could actually tackle that. And so the thing that I found about the inquiry process is that it requires a lot of talking for it to be successful. So the reason I use inquiry, that I have an inquiry classroom, is because I believe it prepares students for the information age by developing skills such as collaboration, problem solving, and critical thinking. Inquiry is a way of learning new skills and knowledge for understanding and creating in the midst of rapid technological change, which is definitely our society. Over 20 years of research shows that inquiry learning is a framework that not only develops these skills, but also promotes independence and fosters information literacy, while at the same time teaching the content required by the curriculum that I have. Inquiry learning prepares students to meet the high level of literacy required in our global information environment. So during the inquiry process, there are 5 types of learning that occur. And this is essentially the main reason why I use it, because there is so much learning that occurs on so many different levels. So first, students learn the curriculum content, right? This is your basic, intro level, looking at data, interpreting its meaning and its importance, and eventually synthesizing multiple viewpoints into a new construct. As you go through that, you move higher up Bloom's taxonomy. Secondly, information literacy is developed. You've got all these sources that are available via the internet and print, and students must learn to locate and evaluate and use reliable sources in their learning. With the wealth of knowledge expanding exponentially, this is a skill that is critical to the inquiry learning process. And learning how to learn, or metacognition, is the 3rd skill that is developed in inquiry learning. And this is where students actually think about the learning that is occurring, and it occurs through a lot of reflection. And so often this will occur through something like journal writing. And the 4th skill that is developed is literacy competence in the strands of reading, writing, speaking, and representing, and also learning how to listen to others for guided inquiry to be successful. And 5thly, within a community of learners, cooperation and collaborative skills are fostered. And these are often the skills that my students struggle with the most, because up until I have them, usually collaboration is not something they've done well, or done at all. So because there are so many types of learning that are occurring at the same time, it requires conversation about all that's going on. I need to be talking with my students about each of those 5 different types of learning. And so this comes back to the idea that there needs to be a lot of discussion, especially at the beginning when students aren't aware of the inquiry process, of what it involves, of what it requires of them. So it's not enough for students to be learning in these ways. They need to be conscious and intentional about the learning that's occurring for it to actually be deep and meaningful and reflective. And so because inquiry learning gives so much to my students, this is the reason that I have created an inquiry classroom for the learning that occurs in my classroom.